The Krathon Empire had swept through the Outer Rim like a storm of death, and 12 colony worlds had fallen in just 12 weeks, and their defenses meant nothing against weapons that bent reality itself, and the Galactic Council met in emergency session and their holographic forms flickered with terror they could not hide. Commander Jake Morrison stood in the war room of Earth Defense Command and watched the tactical display paint a picture that grew worse by the hour, and red markers showed fallen worlds and yellow-marked colonies under siege, and the blue markers for human positions were disappearing one by one. Admiral Helen Carter looked exhausted, and her face showed the strain of 2 days without sleep, and she had been coordinating the evacuation of New Harmony before it fell. And now she spoke with a voice heavy with despair and said, "They are cutting through our lines like we are made of paper, and the Krathons have phase technology that makes our shields useless." Lieutenant Sophie Grant worked at her console and pulled up battlefield recordings from Haven's Rest Colony, and the footage showed Krathon warriors that stood 8 feet tall and wore armor that seemed to exist outside normal space and human. Plasma rounds passed through them like they were ghosts, and energy shields collapsed without slowing them down at all. Captain Victor Hayes asked the question everyone was thinking and said, "How do you fight something you cannot hit?" And the room fell silent because no one had an answer. Jake had spent 15 years in the Colonial Marines and fought pirates and separatists and seen men die in every way possible. But this was different, and this was extinction, looking humanity in the face. And he studied the footage with cold eyes and said quietly, "There has to be a weakness, and everything has a weakness." Helen turned to him with desperate eyes and said, "If you can find it, Commander, you will save billions of lives, because right now we are looking at the end of human civilization in this sector, and the Council is already discussing surrender terms." The word surrender hung in the air like a death sentence, and humanity had never surrendered, and not in the resource wars, and not during the Great Expansion, and not when the plague ships came from the dark between stars, but they had never faced anything like the Krathon Empire. Lieutenant Chris Palmer burst into the war room with his face flushed from running and said, "Admiral, we just received a distress call from the research station on Titan's moon, and the Krathons have entered the Sol system." The room went completely silent, and Earth's home system had never been breached, and not in 300 years of spacefaring history. Helen's jaw tightened, and she asked how long until they reach Earth. Chris said 72 hours and maybe less. Jake felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, and it was not fear exactly, but something that had been forged in the mud of a dozen colony wars. And he looked around the room at the other officers and saw the same desperate calculation in their eyes. Jake said, "We need to buy time and pull together every combat veteran we have, and everyone who has seen real fighting." Helen asked for what purpose. Jake replied, and his voice was like iron, and said to do what humans do best, and to refuse to die quietly. Across the Sol system, the call went out, and veterans who had retired to quiet lives on Mars answered, and colonial marines stationed on Europa's ice platforms came, and the hardened soldiers who had held the line on Proxima Station when the separatists came all responded without hesitation, because they understood something the Galactic Council did not understand. Humanity had never been the strongest species and never the smartest or the most technologically advanced, but they had one quality that had carried them from the caves of Earth to the stars themselves, and they simply would not give up. As the Krathon fleet drew closer and burned through space with terrible purpose, Jake Morrison assembled his team, and 40,000 soldiers came from every corner of human space, and they were scarred and tired and facing an enemy that seemed invincible. But they were also the descendants of people who had crossed oceans in wooden boats and who had walked on the moon with nothing but mathematics and courage, and who had survived ice ages and pandemics and wars that threatened to end everything. Jake stood before his assembled soldiers in the main hangar of Luna Station and looked at faces that showed every kind of human experience, and some were young and some were old, and all of them knew they might be about to die. He spoke clearly, so everyone could hear, and said, "The Krathons think we are weak, and they think we will break. Like every other species they have conquered, and they have never lost a battle and never had to fight for ground they wanted to take, and they are about to learn something important." The soldiers listened, and Jake continued and said, "We are not the strongest, and we are not the fastest, and our weapons are not the most advanced, but we have something they do not have, and we have the ability to adapt and to learn and to refuse to accept defeat." A young private in the front row asked, "Sir, how do we fight enemies we cannot touch?" Jake smiled grimly and said, "We watch them, and we learn their patterns, and we find the moment when they are vulnerable, and then we hit them with everything we have, and we make them pay for every inch of ground they take." Sergeant Danny Cole stepped forward, and he was a grizzled Marine with scars on his face and arms, and he had fought in the border conflicts and seen things that would break most people, and he said, "Commander, we analyzed the combat footage, and the Krathons phase in and out of normal space, but there is a pattern and a split-second delay when they transition, and that is when they can be hurt." Jake asked, "How long is the delay?" Danny said 0.3 seconds and maybe less. Captain Lisa Wong laughed harshly and said, "That is impossible because human reaction time is 0.25 seconds on average, and no one can target and fire that fast." Jake looked at the footage again and watched frame by frame as a Krathon warrior phased through a defensive line and said, "Then, we predict where they will be, and they are arrogant, and they follow the most direct path, because they have never had to do otherwise." Helen's face appeared on the view screen and she looked older than her years and said, "Commander Morrison, the Council has issued an official surrender, and we have been ordered to stand down." Jake replied calmly and said with respect, "Admiral, I did not hear that order." Helen's expression softened slightly and she said, "No, I suppose you did not, and the communication must have been disrupted by solar interference, and how unfortunate, and the connection cut out." Jake turned back to his soldiers, and they were a rough-looking group, and scars and prosthetics were common among them, and these were men and women who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and kept fighting anyway. He said, "You all know what is coming, and the Krathons expect us to fold, and they expect us to run, and they have conquered 40 worlds in the past year, and not one of them made the Krathons bleed for it." And he paused and met their eyes one by one and said, "We are going to change that." The forward defense station on Luna's far side had become humanity's last stand, and Jake Morrison stood in the command center, watching the Krathon fleet emerge from quantum space like a swarm of darkness and hatred itself. Sophie Grant observed from her tactical console and said, "They are not even trying to hide their approach, and they think we are already beaten." Jake said, "Good, and let them think that." The past 60 hours had been a blur of preparation, and while the Galactic Council debated surrender terms and the civilian government evacuated Earth's population to underground bunkers, Jake and his veterans had been working on something different. Sergeant Danny Cole approached with a datapad and said, "Commander, we have analyzed every second of combat footage and the Krathons phase in and out of normal space, but there is a pattern and a split-second delay when they transition, and that is when they are vulnerable." Jake asked how long. Danny said 0.3 seconds and maybe less. Captain Lisa Wong had been working on weapon systems, and she laughed harshly and said, "That is impossible because human reaction time is 0.25 seconds on average, and no one can target and fire that fast." Jake replied, "Then we will have to predict where they are going to be." And he pulled up the combat footage again and watched frame by frame as a Krathon warrior phased through a defensive line and said, "They are arrogant, and they follow the most direct path because they have never had to do otherwise." Helen's face appeared on the main view screen, and she looked like she had aged 10 years in 3 days and said, "Commander Morrison, the Council has issued an official surrender, and we have been ordered to stand down." Jake replied with respect, "Admiral, I did not hear that order." Helen's expression softened almost imperceptibly and said, "No, I suppose you did not. And the communication must have been disrupted by solar interference, and how unfortunate, and the connection cut out." Jake turned to his assembled soldiers, and they were a rough-looking group, and scars and prosthetics were common. And these were men and women who had seen the worst the galaxy could offer and kept fighting anyway. He said, "You all know what is coming, and the Krathons expect us to fold, and they expect us to run. And they have conquered 40 worlds in the past year, and not one of them made them bleed for it." And he paused and said, "We are going to change that." Private Amy Chen was fresh from the Colonial Academy, but had eyes that seemed older than her years, and she raised her hand and said, "Sir, even if we can hit them during their phase transition, we are outnumbered 100 to 1. Jake replied, "Then we will have to make each shot count." The Krathon fleet entered weapon range, and their ships were biological nightmares and all organic curves and pulsing membranes that suggested something alive and hungry, and the lead vessel was a massive dreadnought that made Earth's largest battleships look like toys, and it began to glow with sickly green light. Sophie announced that phase bombardment was incoming and said shields will not stop it. Jake ordered all personnel to hardened positions and said, remember the training and watch for the pattern and watch for the transition moment. The bombardment began in green fire that existed partially outside normal space, tore through Luna's surface and vaporized rock and metal. And the defense station shook like a toy in a child's hand. And alarms screamed, and the lights flickered and died and were replaced by emergency red lighting that made the command center look like a vision of hell. But the station held, and the reinforced bunkers that had been dug deep into Luna's crust over the past 3 days absorbed the punishment. Then the Krathon ground forces began their assault, and they phased directly into what they thought were defenseless positions and expected to find panicked humans running for their lives. Instead, they found Jake Morrison's veterans waiting. The first wave of Krathon warriors materialized in Sector 7, and Danny Cole had predicted their landing zone with perfect accuracy, and the moment they began to phase in and were still translucent, and ghostly a precisely coordinated volley of armor-piercing rounds tore through them. The Krathons fell, and some of them made it far enough into normal space to scream before they died. Danny's voice crackled over the comm and said, "Target confirmed and the bastards can bleed." Across the defense perimeter, the pattern repeated, and Lieutenant Kevin Ross and his squad caught a Krathon strike team mid-phase in Sector 3, and Lisa Wong's artillery crews used predictive firing patterns and hammered phase transition points before the enemy even fully materialized. The Krathons discovered something they had never experienced before, and it was resistance that actually worked. But they adapted quickly, and the second wave came harder and faster, and phased in from multiple directions, and Corporal Nina Flores and her fire team held Junction Delta for 17 minutes against overwhelming odds, and when reinforcements finally reached them, they found Nina standing alone among piles of Krathon dead, and her armor was shattered, and her rifle barrel glowed, red from sustained fire. She said they are not so tough before she collapsed. The battle raged for 6 hours, and the Krathons threw wave after wave at the lunar defense station, and Jake coordinated from the command center, and his voice stayed calm and steady even as explosions rocked the structure around him, and he moved units like chess pieces, and stayed one step ahead of the enemy's predictable tactics. Sophie reported that they had lost Sectors 4 and 9, and said the enemy is attempting to flank through the Mare Tranquillitatis tunnels. Jake ordered her to send Hayes and his demo team and said collapse the tunnels and bury them. Victor Hayes and his demolition experts brought down 3 kilometers of ancient mining tunnels and entombed 200 Krathon warriors in Luna's dust. As the battle entered its 7th hour, something changed in the Krathon assault, and they began to hesitate and to hold back, and the invincible conquerors who had crushed 40 worlds without meaningful resistance were learning caution. They were learning fear. Helen's face reappeared on the view screen, and she looked stunned and said, "Commander, we are tracking a massive withdrawal, and the Krathon fleet is pulling back from Luna." Jake allowed himself a thin smile and said, "They came here expecting to step on insects, and instead they found soldiers, and humans do not break easy, Admiral. Helen said you have bought us time and maybe enough to figure out how to actually win this war." Jake replied, "That is the plan," and he looked around the command center at his exhausted and bloodied but unbroken soldiers, and said, "We just taught the Krathons something that every other species in the galaxy learned the hard way, and humanity does not surrender, and we adapt and we overcome, and we never ever stop fighting." The defense station fell quiet except for the sound of medics moving through the corridors and the soft beeping of damaged equipment, and Jake walked through the sections where his soldiers had fought and died and held the line against impossible odds. He found Danny Cole sitting against a wall and checking his rifle with methodical precision, even though the battle was over, and Danny looked up and said, "We actually did it, Commander, and we made them retreat." Jake nodded and said, "This is just the beginning, and they will come back and they will be angry, but now we know they can be beaten, and that changes everything." Amy Chen appeared beside them, and her young face was streaked with dust and blood, and she said, "Sir, what happens now?" Jake looked toward Earth hanging in the black sky above Luna and said, "Now we prepare for the real war. And because the Krathons will not accept this defeat, and they will throw everything they have at us, and we need to be ready." The Krathon withdrawal from Luna sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council, and for the first time in their century-long expansion, the supposedly invincible empire had retreated from a battlefield, and the council chambers buzzed with frantic speculation. But Jake Morrison knew better than to celebrate. and in his experience a wounded predator was twice as dangerous as a confident one. He told Helen during the debriefing that they will be back and they will be angry. Helen replied, "Then we use the time we have," and she pulled up a star chart showing the outer rim and said, "Intelligence reports that the Krathons are consolidating their forces, and they are pulling units from garrison duty on conquered worlds, and whatever they are planning, it is going to be big." Sophie had barely slept since the Battle of Luna, but her mind was working with crystal clarity, and she had been analyzing Krathon communications intercepts with the help of Colonel Marcus Perry, who was Earth's top expert on alien languages. Sophie said, "Commander, we have decoded part of their command structure," and she projected a complex hierarchy on the main display and said the Krathons operate on a caste system, and the warriors we fought on Luna were their equivalent of basic infantry, but there are higher castes and hunters and berserkers, and at the top something they call the Void Princes. Lisa Wong asked, "How much worse can it get?" Marcus explained that the warriors they fought can phase through normal matter, and the hunters can phase through time, and they see probable futures, making them nearly impossible to ambush, and the berserkers. He paused and his face was grim and said they phase through biological matter and walk through a soldier, and their nervous system shuts down instantly. The room went silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Jake said finally, "So we need to get better." Over the next 3 weeks, Jake implemented a training program that pushed human soldiers to their absolute limits, and he brought in every veteran who had survived close combat with the Krathons, and they studied the enemy's movements and their tactics and their psychology. Danny developed a new form of combat he called probability fighting, and instead of reacting to where the enemy was, soldiers learned to predict where they would be, and it required an almost meditative state of awareness and reading tiny patterns in enemy behavior. Amy, despite her youth, proved to have a natural gift for it, and she explained during a training session that it is like they are dancing to music only they can hear, but once you learn the rhythm, you can anticipate the steps. Kevin focused on small unit tactics, and the Krathons were used to fighting in large formations and overwhelming defenders with numbers, and Kevin trained teams of 4 to 6 soldiers to operate as independent hunting packs and hitting supply lines and communication nodes. Victor took the concept of warfare to new levels, and if the Krathons could phase through matter, he would make matter itself the weapon, and his engineers developed minds that existed in a state of quantum flux and detonating in multiple phases of reality simultaneously. But Jake knew that technology and tactics alone would not be enough, and the real advantage humanity had was something the Krathons could not understand, and it was adaptability, born from centuries of fighting each other. He told his assembled commanders that we are not the strongest species and we are not the smartest, but we are the most stubborn, and we learn fast, and every war we have fought and every battle we have lost has taught us something, and the Krathons have been winning for so long, they have forgotten how to learn. The chance to prove his theory came sooner than expected, and a Krathon hunter pack was detected approaching the mining colony of New Reno on the asteroid belt, and the colony's 12,000 inhabitants were in the middle of evacuation when the attack began. Jake took personal command of the defense, and he brought with him a hand-picked team and Danny and Sophie and Amy and Kevin, and 30 of the best soldiers humanity had produced, and they arrived on New Reno 4 hours before the Krathons. Sophie observed as they set up their positions among the mining tunnels and said, "This is a trap, and they are using the colonists as bait to draw us out." Jake said, "I know, and so we make it a trap for them instead." The Krathons arrived in their usual style and confident and aggressive, but these were hunters and a full caste above the warriors they had fought on Luna, and they were taller and faster, and wore armor that shimmered through multiple phases of existence simultaneously. They moved through the colony like ghosts and phasing through walls and floors, and they could see 3 seconds into probable futures, making ambushes nearly impossible, and they cut down the rear guard of the evacuation convoy with contemptuous ease. Then they entered the mining tunnels where Jake was waiting. He said quietly over the comm, "Remember, they can see what you are probably going to do, so do something improbable." Amy was the first to make contact, and she was alone in a tunnel junction when a Krathon hunter phased through the wall behind her, and it raised its weapon, having already seen the future where it killed her. But Amy did something no rational soldier would do. and she threw her weapon backward over her shoulder without looking, and then dove forward into a roll, and the rifle, tumbling end over end, triggered its proximity sensor and detonated the experimental charge that Victor had installed. The explosion caught the hunter mid-phase, and it died screaming, and its body torn between 3 different states of reality. Amy reported, and her voice was shaking, but steady, and said, "One down, and improbable enough for you, Commander." Across the tunnel network, Jake's soldiers fought like nothing the Krathon hunters had ever encountered, and they used randomness as a weapon in making split-second decisions that even they could not predict. And Danny used a coin flip to decide when to fire, and breaking the pattern of probability, and Kevin had his team draw lots to determine who would attack first, and removing all tactical logic from their assault. The hunters, for all their ability to see the future, could not predict chaos. But there were too many of them, and they were learning, and the Krathon commander was a massive specimen with armor that pulsed with darker energy than the others, and it began to coordinate its forces with cold intelligence. Jake found himself in Section D7 and cut off from his team, and 3 hunters phased through the walls surrounding him, and their weapons tracked his movements, and he could see their mandibles clicking in what might have been laughter. Then, Lisa's voice crackled over the comm and said, "Fire in the hole." The entire section of tunnel collapsed as shaped charges detonated in carefully calculated sequence, and Jake had just enough time to throw himself into a maintenance shaft before several hundred tons of rock buried the hunters. Lisa asked dryly if that was improbable enough. The battle raged for 3 hours, and it was brutal and chaotic and nothing like the clean tactical victories simulations had promised. But when it was over, the Krathon hunter pack had been destroyed to the last warrior. Jake stood among the wreckage, and his armor was dented and scarred, and around him his soldiers were checking on wounded comrades and securing the area, and they had lost 8 people and 8 humans who would never see their families again. But they had won, and against an enemy that could see the future, humanity had prevailed by embracing chaos and unpredictability. Helen's face appeared on Jake's helmet display and said, "Commander, the Galactic Council is requesting a meeting, and they want to know how you did it." Jake replied and told them the truth and said, "We did it by being human, and by refusing to follow the rules of how a battle is supposed to go, and the Krathons fight with precision and predictability, and we fight with improvisation and sheer bloody-minded determination." The Galactic Council's emergency session was unlike anything in its 3,000-year history, and representatives from 40 species filled the chamber. But all eyes were on the human delegation, and Admiral Helen Carter stood at the podium with Commander Jake Morrison beside her in his combat-worn uniform. The council leader was a crystalline being named Shalar, whose species had been the first to fall to the Krathons decades ago, and spoke with a voice like singing glass and said, "Humanity has accomplished what we believed impossible, and you have not merely survived the Krathon Empire, but you have defeated them in open battle twice." Helen replied with respect and said, "We have won tactical victories, but the war is far from over." A voice came from the Vorian delegation and said, "Then teach us, and teach us how to fight them." Jake stepped forward and said, "You do not need us to teach you how to fight, and you need to remember what you have forgotten. And the Krathons conquered your worlds because you followed the rules of civilized warfare, and there are no rules in survival, and there is only winning or dying." A murmur ran through the chamber, and some species found his words crude, but others leaned forward with new interest. Jake continued and said, "The Krathons will return, and when they do, they will not come for just Luna or New Reno, but they will come for Earth itself, and they need to prove they are still invincible, or their entire empire will start to crack. And we need to be ready not just to defend, but to strike back." Shalar's crystalline form pulsed with what might have been shock and said, "Strike back? And you propose attacking the Krathon Empire directly?" Jake said, "I propose showing them that they made a mistake when they decided to go to war with humanity, and we are going to hit their supply lines and their forward bases and their command structure, and we are going to make them bleed for every inch of space they try to take." Over the next 4 weeks, Earth transformed into a fortress and a forge, and the dockyards around Luna worked around the clock and retrofitted ships with the new phase disruption technology that Victor and his team had developed, and soldiers from across human space underwent the brutal new training regimen that Danny had perfected. But Jake knew they needed intelligence, and they needed to know where the Krathons were massing their forces, and what their command structure looked like, and where their leadership was located. He announced during a strategy meeting that I am taking a team deep into Krathon territory. The room erupted in protests, and Lisa said flatly that is suicide, and we have barely held them off in our own space, and going into theirs is insane. Jake replied, which is exactly why they will not expect it, and he pulled up a star chart showing the Krathon Empire's sprawl across the Outer Rim, and said intelligence suggests their high command operates from a fortress world called Krath Prime, and if we can gather information on their forces and their technology, and maybe even capture one of their leaders, we turn this from a defensive war into something we can actually win. Helen studied the map with the expression of someone doing calculations she did not like and asked, "How many soldiers would you need?" Jake said, 12 and small team and fast insertion and faster extraction and any more, and we are too visible and any less, and we do not have the skills we need. Helen laughed, but there was no humor in it, and said 12 soldiers against an entire empire, and you realize this sounds like a bad war movie. Jake replied, "Good thing we are writing a better ending." He assembled his team carefully, and Danny for combat expertise, and Sophie for intelligence and communications, and Amy for her uncanny ability to predict enemy patterns, and Kevin for small unit tactics, and Victor for demolitions and engineering, and 7 others each, the best humanity had in their field. They took a modified stealth frigate called the Defiant, and stripped of everything except engines and weapons and life support, and the ship was designed to be invisible to sensors and a ghost ship that could slip through enemy lines. The journey to Krathon space took 8 days, and they traveled through rarely used jump routes and ancient paths that predated modern civilization, and Jake spent the time reviewing everything they knew about the enemy and memorizing faces and patterns until he saw them in his sleep. On the 9th day, they entered the outer system of Krath Prime. What they found stopped them cold. The fortress world was surrounded by a fleet that dwarfed anything the Krathons had sent against humanity, and hundreds of bioships, and each one a living weapon, and in orbit around the planet itself was something that defied description, and a massive structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and its edges bleeding into spaces that human eyes could not quite process, Sophie whispered. And her face was pale and said, "That is their command citadel, and Jake, there must be millions of Krathons down there." Jake replied, "Then we will have to be very quiet." They landed on one of Krath Prime's moons and hiding the Defiant in a crater, and from there they used a captured Krathon shuttle to approach the planet itself, and the shuttle's biological systems fooled the orbital sensors at least long enough for them to reach the upper atmosphere. The mission nearly ended before it began when a patrol of Krathon hunters swept through their landing zone, and Amy saved them by predicting their patrol route and leading the team through a series of ruins that predated even the Krathons' occupation. Victor observed and ran his scanner over ancient walls and said these structures are old and really old, and the Krathons did not build this world, and they conquered it. They spent 3 days infiltrating deeper into the fortress complex, and it was like walking through a nightmare made solid, and the Krathons had built their citadel from living matter and walls that pulsed with organic rhythms, and floors that felt disturbingly warm underfoot, and everywhere Krathon warriors and higher castes moved with lethal purpose. Kevin discovered a data node in what appeared to be a strategic planning chamber, and Sophie plugged in one of Victor's custom interface devices designed to mimic Krathon biosignatures. She whispered, "I am in, and Jake, you need to see this." The data was staggering, and the Krathons were not just planning to attack Earth, but they were planning to destroy it completely and to make an example so brutal that every other species in the galaxy would surrender without a fight, and the assault force they were assembling was 10 times larger than anything they had used before. But more importantly, Sophie found their command structure, and the Void Princes and the ultimate leaders of the Krathon Empire were gathering on Krath Prime for a war council, and all of them in one place. Jake said quietly, "This is it, and this is how we end the war." Danny hissed, "Are you insane? And we are 12 people, and we cannot assassinate the entire Krathon leadership." Jake agreed, "No, but we can send a message, and what happened next would be debated by military historians for generations." Commander Jake Morrison and his team of 12 soldiers infiltrated the heart of the Krathon Empire's power, and they planted Victor's experimental quantum charges at key points throughout the command citadel, and devices that would phase detonate across multiple dimensions simultaneously. They were discovered on the way out, and a void prince itself cornered them in a transit corridor, and it was a creature of nightmare and shadow that stood 12 feet tall and radiated an aura that made human minds scream in terror. The battle that followed lasted less than 5 minutes, and the void prince was everything the legends claimed, and impossibly fast and able to phase through attacks and see probable futures and project psychic force that crushed weaker minds, and it killed 3 of Jake's soldiers in the first 30 seconds. But Jake had spent months learning to fight the impossible, and he had learned to embrace chaos and to make decisions that even he could not predict, and to fight with a fury born from the knowledge that humanity's entire future rested on this moment. While the Void Prince focused on Jake, both Amy and Danny executed a maneuver they had literally decided on by coin flip, and they crossed fire patterns in a way that made no tactical sense, and caught the Prince between overlapping quantum disruption fields. For just a moment, the Void Prince was locked into a single phase of reality. Victor detonated a directional charge at point-blank range. The Void Prince fell, and Icor sprayed from wounds that crossed multiple dimensions, and it died trying to understand how these primitive creatures had killed it. Jake shouted, "Move, and the whole complex is going to know we are here." They ran through corridors that were starting to pulse with alarm, and Krathon warriors materialized from walls and floors, and the team fought their way back to the stolen shuttle, and leaving bodies and burning wreckage in their wake. Kevin took a phase weapon blast to the chest and died instantly, and Corporal Shane Lewis stayed behind to hold a choke point and buying time for the others to escape, and his last transmission was him laughing as the corridor collapsed around him. The Defiant broke orbit just as Victor's charges detonated, and the command citadel in the heart of the Krathon Empire tore itself apart across 7 different dimensions, and billions of tons of living architecture collapsed into quantum chaos, and the shockwave destroyed dozens of bioships in orbit, and 6 of the 7 Void Princes died in an instant. Jake watched from the Defiance bridge as Krath Prime's orbit filled with debris and bodies, and they had lost 5 soldiers and 5 humans who would never go home, but they had also decapitated the Krathon Empire. He said quietly, "Set course for Earth and get me Admiral Carter, and she needs to prepare for a counteroffensive, because the Krathons are about to learn what happens when you make humanity angry." The destruction of the command citadel sent shockwaves across the galaxy, and the Krathon Empire, which had seemed unstoppable for a century, suddenly found itself leaderless and reeling. The Defiant limped back to Earth over 2 weeks, and its engines damaged from the desperate escape, and Jake spent the journey writing letters to the families of the soldiers who had not made it back. Sophie found him in the ship's small observation deck and said quietly, "You cannot carry all of them, and we knew the risks." Jake replied, "That does not make it easier," and he was staring out at the stars and at the vast emptiness between human space and the Krathon Empire, and said they trusted me to bring them home. Sophie countered, "You brought 7 of us home, and you struck a blow that might save billions, and that has to count for something." When the Defiant finally reached Earth, they found a system transformed, and the shipyards around Luna had tripled in size, and new defensive platforms dotted the orbital space around Earth and Mars. And most surprisingly, ships from a dozen Galactic Council species had arrived to join the defense. Helen met them personally at the docking bay, and she looked tired but grimly satisfied and said, "Commander Morrison, welcome back, and we were starting to think we had lost you." Jake said, "Almost did, and Admiral, we need to talk, and the Krathons are going to come for us with everything they have left, and they need to prove they are still dangerous or their entire empire will fracture." Helen replied, "Let them come, and thanks to the data you transmitted, we know their fleet movements and their supply lines and their command codes, and we have allies now. And the Council species saw what you did, and they are ready to fight." The final battle began 3 weeks later, and the Krathon Empire assembled the largest fleet in its history, and over 3,000 bioships carrying millions of warriors, and they came through jump space like a plague, and emerging in Earth's outer system, with genocidal intent. But they did not find a helpless species waiting to be slaughtered, and they found humanity allied with 40 other species and ready for war. The Battle of Earth lasted 5 days, and it was fought in the asteroid belt and around Jupiter's moons, And in the orbital space above Mars and the Krathons threw everything they had at the defenders, and for a while it seemed like it might be enough. On the second day, Danny led a boarding action against a Krathon command ship, and his team of 50 Marines fought through corridors of living nightmare and ultimately destroyed the ship's phase drive and caused it to tear itself apart from the inside. On the third day, Lisa's artillery platforms around Luna shattered a Krathon assault wave that had broken through the main defensive line, and she fired for 18 hours straight until the barrels of her cannons glowed white-hot and ammunition ran critically low. On the fourth day, Amy coordinated a desperate defense of Mars's orbital elevator, and she was just 22 years old and exhausted beyond measure, but she held the line with a company of soldiers against wave after wave of Krathon berserkers, and when asked later how she had managed it, she simply said because giving up was not an option. Jake commanded from the bridge of the newly commissioned battleship Resolute, and it was the largest warship humanity had ever built, and bristling with weapons that combined human engineering with technology shared by the Council species. But its real weapon was its crew and veterans of Luna and New Reno, and 100 smaller battles and soldiers who had learned to fight the impossible and win. On the fifth day, the Krathon fleet broke, and not because they were defeated militarily, though they had lost over half their ships, but they broke because they realized they were fighting an enemy that simply would not stop, and every time the Krathons pushed forward, humans pushed back harder, and every tactical advantage the Krathons deployed, humans found a counter for. The surviving Void Prince and the last of the Krathon leadership made the calculation that would doom its empire, and it ordered a retreat. The retreat became a rout, as Council species fleets, emboldened by humanity's example, pursued the Krathons. Back toward the Outer Rim and conquered worlds rose up in rebellion, inspired by the idea that the supposedly invincible empire could bleed. Jake watched it all from the Resolute's bridge and feeling something he had not allowed himself to feel in months, and it was hope. And Sophie reported that they were receiving surrender requests from Krathon garrison commanders across 6 systems, and they are asking for terms. Jake replied, "Tell them they will be treated according to Galactic Convention, and we are not conquerors and we never were, and we were just defending our home," and the war officially ended 8 months later.